Good evening. Welcome to the 2025 Henry Marshall Tory Lecture. My name is Kate Freeman. I'm currently serving as the Secretary of the Friends of the University of Alberta. So that you do know you're in the right place, we are very pleased to have Dr. Greg Anderson with us this evening to present the lecture. But before he begins, I have to take a few minutes of your time, very few. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Alberta, its buildings, labs, and research stations are primarily located on the territory of the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Stoney, Dene, Iroquois, and Ojibwe Saulteaux, lands that are now known as part of Treaties 6, 7, and 8, and homeland of the Métis. The University of Alberta respects the sovereignty, lands, histories, languages, knowledge systems, and cultures of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit nations. And now a touch of housekeeping. The talk is being presented in person, obviously, but it's also being live streamed. So welcome to those from away. We do recommend using speaker view rather than, speaker view rather than gallery view to those of you online, and ask that you use the chat function for any questions that you may have for Greg. Send chats to the co-hosts, and there are behind-the-scenes volunteers who are right over there. Will accumulate the questions, and they'll ask them at the end of the talk. I can't resist the opportunity to tell you a little bit about the Friends of the University of Alberta. We were established in 1943, but not with this board. And we're a group of volunteers with a mission to build and nurture a community that celebrates and champions the University of Alberta. We work to encourage connections between the university and the broader community. I will highlight a few of our initiatives. Since 1956, the Friends have hosted the Henry Marshall Tory Lectures, which are free public lectures featuring renowned speakers to engage the broader community in front-of-mind topics. The Friends have endowed annual scholarships and student awards. We also are proud to support 2 University of Alberta programs that connect the broader community with the university. The first one I'll highlight is U-School, which is a program run by the University of Alberta Senate that introduces students in grades 4 through 9 from socially vulnerable Aboriginal and rural communities to the university. And the other program is Humanities 101, or HUM 101. It's run by the Faculty of Arts, and it offers free, non-credit, university-level courses for Albertans with a passion for learning, but whose circumstances have certain barriers that make post-secondary education inaccessible. We are, as the Friends, in our 8th decade of service to the university and the community, and we welcome anyone who's interested in the university to join us. No prior connection is required. All you need is an interest. There are no membership fees, and we do not solicit for funds, courtesy of a casino that several of us have just finished working at. Being a friend, you do receive information about our upcoming events first. And then to find out more about all of our initiatives or to join us, visit our website at friendsoftheuofa.ca or follow us on Twitter at Friends of U of A, excuse me. Now, to this evening's Tory Lecture. Again, since I get to speak first, I'm going to tell you about Dr. Henry Marshall Tory. I've done a little bit more research just recently, and he's fascinating. He's referred to as the Dean of Canadian Educators in the first half of the 20th century, and he was the first president of the University of Alberta. I would like to remind you that the U of A was founded as a non-denominational, co-educational, liberal arts institution at a time when that was considered frivolous, because this was the Bald-Ass Prairie after all. Tory's legacy in Canadian education and research is vast. Besides the University of Alberta, Tory was also the principal founder of what are now the University of British Columbia and the University of Victoria. The University of British Columbia was founded as the McGill University College in Vancouver, and the University of Victoria, founded as the McGill University College in Victoria. Tory was indeed a professor at McGill before he came west to establish connections between the West Coast and McGill. But he stopped in Alberta on the way home. That's another story. He also founded the Khaki University for soldiers that were stuck in Europe towards the end of the Second World War and after the Second World War. And somewhere in the order of 50 to 60,000 people attended lectures. And he worked with other university presidents to ensure that they would be granted credit for the work they had done. He also established Alberta Innovates, which was then called the Alberta Research Council. He established, or was fundamental in establishing, the National Research Council, and also Carleton University. Dr. R.W. Boyle, Tory's Dean of Science at the University of Alberta, an associate of the National Research Council, provided this epitaph, and I'm going to quote it. Henry Marshall Tory was a man of his times and exactly suited to his period of Canadian history. Teacher, preacher, philosopher, man of action, conspicuous scientist. Without leaving treatises or formal scientific contributions in papers or memoirs on specific research, he was a great missionary and proponent of research and contributed greatly to the adoption of science to his country's needs. Without leaving any formal dissertation of philosophy, he was a philosopher of education, and without serving in any legislative hall, he became Canadian statesman at large for both science and education. He was a great initiator and founder of learning institutions designed to last, end quote. Now, the man we're here to hear tonight. Dr. Greg Anderson is a professor of political science. He's been teaching at the University of Alberta since 2004. His teaching and research interests generally flow in and out of the political economy of North America. He's particularly interested in North American integration, the NAFTA, CUSMA, etc., but also spends a lot of time focused on U.S. politics and foreign policy. This is his bio, by the way. Canada-U.S. relations and all kinds of things globally. So I would ask you to welcome Dr. Greg Anderson.
Bear with me a second here. Yes, okay. Thank you very much for that blissfully brief introduction. I appreciate that. When the friends reached out to me in the spring about this, and they said they wanted to hear about Canada-U.S. relations, Donald Trump, I grimaced and I said, "Are you sure you want to hear about that?" And it's partly because, as my younger brother likes to say, Donald Trump has been living rent-free in our heads for years now. Certainly it's been exhausting for me since 2015. He came down the escalator. And so I've been giving a lot of thought to what's been going on in American politics, of course, but also in Canada-U.S. relations and the broader sort of North American integration sphere, but also the global political economy. It helps me to try to understand Donald Trump and what's going on in America and what's going on in Canada-U.S. relations at the moment by trying to put a lot of what's happening in a broader, sort of longer context. Some of what you hear from me tonight might sound like I'm making apologies for what's going on south of the border or for the leadership that's there. It's not meant to be that way. It's really just I'm trying to make sense of it myself and trying to understand something that's bigger that I think is going on, and it's going to be what I'm arguing here. Canada's been here before is also part of what I'm going to say. This is not an unusual environment that we're in, and I'll say why. So I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes talking a little bit about this, and then I'd really like to hear from you as well. So I'm interested in what you have to say. And no smack in the chat, whoever's online, so keep it peaceful. But really, you're going to, students in here, by the way, of mine are going to hear these same old arguments in some cases, so I apologize, but it's not, it won't be a big surprise to some of you. But I don't have a particularly sophisticated way of thinking about international relations. And in many ways, it starts with a pool table and billiard balls rolling around as if it was a global map. The billiard balls are countries. And if we get really serious about international relations, you've got some countries that are bigger, some smaller, measured by, quotients of power, measurements of power, how big is your population, military, economy, et cetera, et cetera. And so the question for Canadian foreign policy in the post-war era has been, how do we prevent the bigger countries from riding roughshod over us? And so I put this little lattice work. And what is this lattice work? I always throw this at my students, ask them, what are the things here that we're talking about? This is the post-war architecture. This is the institutions, the norms, the conventions of practice anchored in treaties, bricks and mortar institutions, et cetera, that have allowed Canada a larger seat at the table than might otherwise be the case if they were trying to push against some of the larger powers. And so this has been the sort of the post-war period orientation of Canadian foreign policy. If there is an institution to be joined, Canada's going to be there. Canada is a small country, small population, gigantic geography. It has to find ways to punch above its weight, so to speak. And there's an entire literature about this. Canada is a middle power, niche diplomacy. Canada is a principal power. There's all this kind of terminology that scholars have come up with to try to make sense of how Canada makes its way in the international system within this post-war architecture. The real challenge now, giving away some of my thunder, is that a lot of that post-war architecture has started to break down very fundamentally. In many ways, what we're seeing right now is a bit of an old movie. I wasn't alive in the interwar years, but the folklore around the interwar years is legendary. The connection between the rise of economic nationalism, defending your populations economically, its connection to the rise of political nationalism, political extremism, and then ultimately hot shooting war is legendary. And here you've got Depression era, Smoot-Hawley era, the onset of the Great Depression, stock market crash. You got imagery, political cartoons around what they call beggar thy neighbor in political science, where you think you're putting up trade barriers to protect your own, and really others are seeing what you're doing and doing exactly the same thing. And we're seeing a lot of that now in the international system. And the political economy of international trade and finance really has a lot of echoes of this period. And the entire post-war architecture, which partly represented by some of these bricks and mortar institutions, was designed at Bretton Woods in 1944, a kind of post-war planning for what the aftermath of World War II was going to look like in financial and political terms. And so they designed these institutions to try and short-circuit some of this arbitrary rise of economic nationalism, create a kind of rules-based order that was more transparent, where smaller countries, Canada was present at the creation, as they say, smaller countries could make their way and argue, at least have a bigger seat at the table, and it wouldn't be the powerful countries that rode roughshod over everybody else. And so you got the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which became the World Trade Organization later, the World Bank. But these were augmented by a whole series of treaties, it's a bottomless pit of treaties, and the establishment of a lot of norms of diplomatic behavior in the post-war era that has largely held until very recently, where there's been a lot of change. In terms of regionalism, we've got a lot of regional configurations, also forms of kind of integration, linkage between countries that might give people pause for second thought before doing something rather arbitrary and rash. North America up there represented, the NAFTA. We got the European Union, of course, Mercosur, which is a common market, an ambitious common market among Southern Cone countries in Latin America. You got the Trans-Pacific Partnership represented here and these are just shallow trade arrangements in some cases. The EU is a big, post-war project to try to eventually create a kind of almost a federal state, similar to what you would have at the integration of a single country, but in terms of the EU. So a much deeper form of integration with many political motivations, namely preventing the Germans and the French from shooting at each other again, but a large political but also economic project designed to bring those countries together and act as a single unit. And so you see this kind of activity going on in the post-war period, this architecture, this broad architecture, both international institutions but also regional configurations that have in a sense been underwritten the kind of post-war peace that we've all been the beneficiaries of. And you can see that in regionalism terms, after 1990 and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, you can see this explosion of regional configurations around the planet. They come in all shapes and sizes, but they are in one way or another designed to link countries together economically, to short circuit that economic nationalism, to bring transparency to economic relations such that you wouldn't have that kind of ultimate political nationalism and hot shooting war. This is sort of the linkage. One of the really interesting things about this period, though, is that at the very same moment you had this explosion of regionalism, you had this creation of a post-Cold War creation of like the NAFTA, the deepening of the European Union through the Maastricht Treaty, the creation of the single currency. You had the free trade area of the Americas, which was never came to fruition. At the peak of these transformations at the end of the Cold War, it seemed as if we were going to get more democratic and richer, and everybody was going to be one big happy family. At the very peak that you saw this kind of neoliberal explosion of optimism around the virtues of capitalism and democracy, you also saw a lot of brewing trouble on the horizon. Probably, most of you or some of you may remember the battle in Seattle, the WTO meeting in 1999, November 99. It was supposed to be a triumphal ministerial meeting to advance the cause of the WTO, expand it, bring more countries in. Instead, it descended into violence and chaos in the streets. It blew up the meeting. It ended in failure. And it was a real signal that, wait a minute, there's something else going on here. We're not as happy with these institutions as we think. And so you saw a lot of resistance. Over here, you've got the Summit of the Americas, which was designed to bring to fruition the free trade area of the Americas. For a very short time, every country in the Western Hemisphere was democratic except for Cuba. And this was designed to capitalize on that. And yet it all kind of came tumbling down. And I was saying this over dinner to people at the table, but the big sign for me that kind of was over or we're heading for real trouble was in 2008 in the United States, when you saw Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama battling it out for the Democratic nomination for president, and they were fighting in Ohio for the nomination, and they were fighting over who was more against the NAFTA. And they couldn't outdo each other in many ways, and so nobody was willing to defend this part of the architecture or extol its virtues or say, wait a minute, there's some problems, they need to be fixed. Instead, in the context of a kind of hollowing out of the industrial Midwest, the politician, nobody was willing to stand up for it. Incidentally, I'll just say right now, Bill Clinton in 1993 spent most of his early political capital pushing for the passage of the NAFTA and never once mentioned it again in the rest of his 2 terms in office. And so it kind of gives you a sign that things were a little bit choppy. These are again images of 2008 with the Democratic nomination. 2016, Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. Very little light to shine between them in terms of economic policy and their attitudes toward trade and trade liberalization and America's role underwriting that post-war architecture around trade and finance. And then Sarah Palin, probably in 2008, John McCain added her to the Republican presidential ticket, probably the earliest form of MAGA. The Republican populism really took off from there and became what it is today. And then, of course, you got Donald Trump announcing for president in 2015. The similarities among them all in terms of economic policy are remarkable. Left and right on economic policy used to mean something in the 80s. You could sort of determine which party represented what. That had converged by 2008 and certainly into some of the political debates in the United States through 2016. And so we end up with this. And it's not just in the United States. As The Economist, which I love, they have wonderful covers. It says so much, but you can see this kind of nationalism, this economic and political nationalism rising everywhere. And in many ways, Donald Trump was not the creator of all of this. Instead, he was kind of a manifestation of big pieces of it. And then the concrete manifestation of this for me was the Brexit vote in 2016. Not Donald Trump's election in the fall of that year, but the Brexit vote, and just the shock of the yes vote to exit the European Union, in a sense, become poorer for a whole bunch of other political reasons, take back our country, et cetera, and cut yourself off, at least in notionally, from your biggest market. That was a big sign. And so you've got this kind of reordering of what the global economy is supposed to be and how the rules are supposed to function. Real doubts and a kind of dismissal of those rules as not functioning for anybody. And so what does that look like going forward is really a big question. And of course, the North America, we're entering a renegotiation or a review of the USMCA. And this is a big question here. The NAFTA, I would argue, going back to 1994, was in a sense dead on arrival. You've had all kinds of populists in the United States attacking the NAFTA from the very beginning. Some of you are old enough in this room to remember the debate on Larry King Live on CNN between Ross Perot and Al Gore about the virtues of the NAFTA. It really set the agreement on a path towards unpopularity in many quarters. But it's been attacked by many people, including our friend Lou Dobbs there, who's no longer with us. But he would go on the TV on CNN in the afternoon and rail against the trade policies of whatever administration was in place at the time, often with really obvious xenophobic kind of overtones. And I was surprised that they let him stay there. But one of the really big things that doomed the NAFTA was actually the very day it was implemented, January 1994. The Zapatista rebellion exploded out of southern Mexico, timed to precisely and intentionally to coincide with the implementation of the NAFTA. And it was a rebellion against neoliberalism, a rebellion against the trade policies, the economic liberalism of the governments of the day. And for a while, it looked as if they actually held parts of southern Mexico for a while. The Mexican government had a difficult time, getting control of it. But then in quick succession, you had political assassination in Tijuana. And then this represents the Mexican peso crisis, also in 1994. So a number of fatal blows to the argument in favor of bringing Mexico into this agreement. So for Americans, trade is connected to, and trade liberalization is mostly about Mexico and the instability along the southern border. It's not so much about Canada in many ways, but it got off to a very bad start on the very day it got going. I want to say a word or two now about the present, because we've all probably seen this formula of how Donald Trump and his administration concocted the reciprocal tariffs. The formula, I'm not going to try to explain it, but it's basically a formula that calculates a trade deficit and then assigns a percentage, and then that's the new tariff. So it's a goofy formula. It looks kind of sophisticated, but they came up with these tariffs, and they're all in court. In fact, today the Supreme Court was having hearings on the use of the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, 1977. And it's really about whether the executive branch has the power to declare an emergency, for how long, and whether tariffs are the appropriate measure to be applying to other countries to respond to said emergency. And so that's what's under debate today. And so, the argument is that fentanyl is the big emergency. There isn't a lot of fentanyl coming in from Canada. So there's a 10% base tariff on everybody. The one caveat, the silver lining for Canada is still the USMCA. Anything that qualifies under that agreement still enters the United States tariff-free. And so Mark Carney has a reasonable point to make when he says we still have the best deal on the planet. We do. And it's not over yet, but we'll see what happens next spring when we review this. So it's that set of tariffs at the top there, the reciprocal tariffs enacted under this Emergency Powers Act that's really at issue in the courts right now. The more longer duration tariffs are these 232 tariffs, which are, they are not going to go away no matter what the court decides in the United States. This is a bigger, longer term problem. Those are traditional measures by which the United States has protected various sectors. They require long investigations, public comments, et cetera, et cetera. They're very sector specific. Those are not going to go away. They're not the kind of sweeping tariffs that have been applied on the basis of some kind of an emergency. And so those are a longer term set of problems for the Carney government in trying to resolve some of these things with the United States. So I promised a discussion about asymmetries. And the asymmetries of power, you can think about those in North America in lots of different ways. And I've been given a little thought to it. And one of the things that you see in the political cartoons and also discussion and even in the academic literature is asymmetries of power are kind of taken for granted, like we understand what they are. And there's surprisingly little literature picking that apart and trying to understand how they function and where Canada can exert itself and exercise leverage versus the United States and vice versa. It's not always these kind of elephant and mouse sort of analogies that are so famous in Canada-U.S. relations. It's a little more nuanced than that. And so I spent a lot of time kind of thinking about this and trying to understand where Canada can exert itself, where Canada kind of gets away with things in some ways, and in a sense kind of abuses the superpower because they're distracted. And so one way to depict the asymmetries between the three countries is just the trade relationship as it's developed over the last 30 years since the NAFTA. And it's really a tale of two bilateral relationships. The relationship between the United States, or between Canada and Mexico has never really evolved. Sadly, Canadians really don't know much about Mexico beyond the beaches of Cancun and vice versa. And so it's really a very robust relationship between Canada and the United States, Mexico and the United States. The two countries, Mexico and Canada, have similar problems. There are similar issues at play, similar discrepancies in terms of their size and power and what their interests are. And they've been remarkably reticent to get together very often, except for photo ops. But that's one way to sort of depict it, is the trade intensity between the three countries. Between Canada and Mexico has been very limited. Here's another chart. Sorry about all the numbers, but the numbers I want to draw to your attention are underlined and bolded under 2023. One way to depict a country's openness to the global economy and or dependence on the global economy is to take exports plus imports as a percentage of GDP. Okay, so what does Canada import? What does it export as a percentage of its GDP? All right. Well, for Canada, it's about 67% of Canada's GDP is in some way or other tied to the global economy, not just the United States, but the global economy. Canada is a trading nation, as is Mexico. Canadians have an intuitive understanding of their standard of living is tied to all of that, their ability to export its excess production and get foreigners to pay for it, essentially. If you look down here at the bottom, Mexico, similarly, about 73% of its economy is tied to the global economy. So very vulnerable to disruptions in those trading patterns. The United States, on the other hand, has this gigantic consumer economy, only about a quarter, and it's only a quarter, but it's grown, if you can see at the bottom there. Only about a quarter of its economy is tied to the rest of the planet in some way or another through exports and imports. And so this gigantic consumer economy really shields it, immunizes it from a lot of the various the changes in the global architecture, some of which it's driving, admittedly. The other one, too, is this notion of diversification that we'll come back to talking about Canada's options. What does it do going forward? Over on the left here, under Canada, you can see that the United States is by far Canada's largest export market. About 70% of Canada's exports go to a single market. About 51% of our imports come from there. Maybe a little less now because we don't drink as much wine from California, I don't know. But you can see afterwards, China as this great export destination. It's just not materialized yet. Mexico, kind of similar sets of dependencies on just a single market. They've really oriented their economy towards access to and from the United States. Whereas the United States has a much more diverse trade profile. And so when you hear Mark Carney yesterday, even during the budget speech, talking about trade diversification, this is something that has been a long-standing problem for Canada and Mexico, trying to diversify its export partners away from the 500-pound colossus that consumes just about everything. It's kind of hard to do, and the incentives don't really align towards diversification. So where do some of these asymmetries come from? Well, Charles Duran, happened to be my supervisor, PhD supervisor, wrote a book in '84 at a time when Canada-U.S. relations was also going through a real kind of rethink. There was real tension between the two countries. And he determined or decided or argued at least that Canada-U.S. relations was made up of three big dimensions. A psychocultural dimension. Canadians, the sort of the cultural colossus of the United States was omnipresent. We were saturated by American media and culture and its products, et cetera. And it really created a kind of anxiety, kind of psychological anxiety among Canadians that Americans didn't appreciate as the sort of the global hegemon. What are you worried about? We don't really mean you any harm, but it does. Trade commercial is another dimension. Canada, its relationship with the United States is all about commercial relations. Canada does a little defense, but it's really about commercial relations. Canadian foreign policy is in part about commercial relations more than almost anything else. And so Canada focuses on this, laser focused on that, whereas the United States has much broader kind of commercial interests around the world. And then political strategic as another dimension. The United States is a global power. It's distracted. It has a gigantic agenda, whether we like it or not. Its tentacles are everywhere. And so, Canada has a tough time getting America's attention sometimes. There's a sense of neglect. Why can't Ottawa pick up the phone and always get the American president on the phone to talk about softwood lumber? Well, there's a war going on, or there's something, so this is one of the big sources of divergence and structural asymmetries between the two countries. They do not have the same agendas or interests at play. And so it's a very complicated global agenda. America gets distracted a lot. There's an inattention that the United States often pays to its immediate neighbors, much to this frustration of Canadians. And so I've kind of, this is a little bit of a repeat, but one of the things that it's allowed Canada to do, and you can see this in the literature, is it's allowed this distraction by the global superpower has allowed Canada to seek exemption, has allowed it to claim that, hey, we have a special relationship, so we should get along, we should be doing things, we should just be one big happy family. And then, of course, exception. The problem with that is that it doesn't always happen. And I've got a couple of examples where this hasn't happened. This is a bit of a mythology in Canada-U.S. relations, that somehow Canada has been able to finagle some exceptions or work the superpower because we're friends. And there is some of that, but it's also oftentimes it doesn't quite look that way when you dig through it. One of the other sources of dust-ups between Canada and the United States is the fact that we've had 35 plus years, maybe way longer if you go back all the way to the Auto Pact in '65, of deepening economic integration. So much so that many of the things that are of interest to Canadian foreign policy around commercial activities are dealt with in an American regulatory, a domestic regulatory setting in which Canada has no standing as a foreign power. And part of the reason for that is the fact that the NAFTA itself doesn't have any ambitions to be like the European Union. It's a very shallow kind of arrangement. It's just about the liberalization of trade and goods. There's no sharing of sovereignty, no supranational institutionalization. And so Canada has a difficult time making its case in an American regulatory environment that affects an awful lot of what Canadians produce and tries to sell in the United States. And this is a regular source of conflict and frustration. Then there's a little bit of bargaining and negotiation. And one of the things I want to say about all of this is that the literature on this is interesting, but it's often retrospective. It's often very material in orientation. So after a negotiation is over, you can tease apart what the parties' interests are and how things unfolded in the negotiating room. And that's a little unsatisfying because you don't know what actually happened in the negotiating room. We have all kinds of asymmetric arrangements, especially in mergers and acquisitions. Big firms gobbling up little firms. The little firm has some power, as do states against the larger powers. But how? How does that happen? What are the circumstances under which Canada can exert its authority or reason with the 500-pound gorilla? And so there's a whole bunch of literature on this that derives from psychology, disaggregations of power, which sadly a lot of my students have been subjected to. But one of the things connected to the way we want to think about Donald Trump as a psychology is the notion of distributive bargaining versus integrative bargaining. For much of Canada-U.S. relations, over the last, the post-war period, you could see a kind of integrative bargaining process where, Canada has some interests, America has some interests, they come together and maybe they add some things to, side letters or, kind of side payments. Donald Trump is a different animal. He looks at the world as a very zero-sum kind of environment where even a victory, if it's interpreted as a loss, is to be avoided at all costs. And he sees the pie to be divided as very finite. And so there's a psychology to that literature and bargaining and negotiation picks apart. This is all laid out, by the way, in his book, but what's over here on the left is actually derived from an academic article, kind of looking at the psychology of those across the table from each other. And what kind of individual are you actually dealing with? It's not necessarily rational. It's more of a kind of a psychological profile of the kind of personality you're dealing with. And so this comes right from this academic article, but it's drawn, you can also see this in Trump's, he didn't write it himself, but in Trump's book. Think big, take big risks. You can see this happening in the way Trump bargains with everybody and the things that he's been doing, even the peace, the ceasefire, the kind of quasi-ceasefire, and that's taking hold in Israel or not taking hold. Losses are perceived, in a sense, much worse than gains. You fight back hard. You try to exploit weakness. You gaslight. I'll say something about the 51st state if I have a little bit of time. We can talk about that. Threats are better than promises. And bargaining is a zero-sum proposition. And then, of course, declare victory. Get out in front of it and declare victory and lock people into your preferences. These are tactics by individuals that come from a kind of psychology of bargaining that Donald Trump used or learned as a real estate developer in New York. And so it's really not that hard to see where this comes from, even if we don't like it. And it's a completely different style from the way prime ministers and presidents used to deal with each other. This kind of repeats a little bit, but this is actually from the journal article that I'm talking about. But there's an aggression, there's a lack of trust that bargainers from this kind of psychological position come from. You set lofty goals and you basically order people to go and make it happen at any cost, a kind of scorched earth approach to things. There's an impulsiveness, an ill-preparedness, a lack of sort of nuance in the way things unfold. And then at the bottom there, unlimited set of ethical tactics to gain advantage. This is really, in his mind, in Donald Trump's mind, it's about gaining advantage and avoiding looking like you have lost something. And so he's bringing this mindset, which is brand new in Canada-U.S. relations, and making it very difficult for not only Canada, but lots of other countries to do this. I kind of asked myself about whether or not there's a kind of secret sauce here. You might all have a view about this, but there's been a real divergence between the way Canada has adopted its posture. It's been a very defensive posture. There's been a bit of retaliation here and there vis-a-vis the United States. But just in the last week or two, you've seen the South Koreans, the British offered up a second state visit. And then, of course, the Japanese are doing things very, very differently to kind of placate, maybe you could say suck up, cow, like just you're bending the knee, whatever you want to say. Whereas Canada is taking a slightly more adversarial approach to things, and we could argue about whether or not one country is getting a better deal than the other. The other three countries have deals in place. so-called deals. Maybe they don't seem like deals to any of us, but Canada, keep having these little dust-ups with Donald Trump, and he throws a little bit of a tantrum and suspends negotiations and so on. What's the best approach to deal with this kind of psychological force in Donald Trump? One of the other things that's in the literature is this reticence in Canada-U.S. relations in the post-war period to engage in linkage politics. So softwood lumber was softwood lumber. Defense issues were defense issues, and they were always walled off from each other. There's been a cultural norm in Canada-U.S. relations against blending things together and trying to complicate things. That has been eroding for most of the post-war period, and I would say that the terrorist attacks after 9/11 probably were the thing that drove that home most vividly. And in fact, the U.S. ambassador, George W. Bush's U.S. Ambassador to Canada, famously said that security trumps trade. And so you had this marriage after 9/11 of a kind of old economic agenda anchored in the NAFTA and a brand new security agenda anchored in the demands, the exigencies of security for the United States. And it drove everything. In spite of Canada taking in, this is Halifax Airport here at the bottom, after 9/11, took in all kinds of airliners, transatlantic flights. Newfoundlanders, famously billeted lots of people when planes landed there as well. It didn't matter. It just seemed to be kind of forgotten and taken for granted. And then a big shot in the teeth was George Bush saying in the joint address to Congress on September 20th, 2011, that America had no greater friend than Great Britain. And Tony Blair's in the gallery, and the hue and cry in Canada in the weeks afterwards was just deafening. Well, I thought we took in all these planes. So this isn't the first time that Canadians have been offended by an American president or the oversight of Americans about their friendly neighbor to the north. This linkage politics, this is just to show you a little bit of the effort that the Canadian government went through after 9/11 to drive home that we were an integrated economy. We were each other's best trading partners. The security dragnet at the border didn't need to happen. These were put out by these maps were put out by the Canadian Embassy in Washington in around 2007. And it's hard to read, of course, but what it shows is each state's connection economically and politically to parts of Canada, either in terms of number of jobs, the kind of trade that it does with various Canadian provinces. And it went through all 50 states to do this, to drive home, and it would drive home this message to anybody in Washington they could find hey, look, we're here, we are your partners in this economically and in terms of security. This other map shows a whole bunch of the commodities and various other things for Canadian provinces and all the stuff that goes into the United States. If you could read this at the very bottom, it's kind of a little, I don't know, cultural thing, but it says none of the 9/11 hijackers came in through Canada. That's what it says along the bottom there, all the way along. None of the 9/11 hijackers. You got the DEW line, the old Cold War DEW line at the top, the radar stations, really showing that, hey, look, we are your partners, trying to convince Americans, American politicians that we are nothing to worry about. And so the Canadian government has done this before. Maybe Doug Ford's recent advertisement on TV during the World Series fits in this vein. I don't know, but it was a real full court press to convince the United States, do not allow this security dragnet to undermine us. And yet we have this linkage politics formally connected. We also had the Security and Prosperity Partnership, which was kind of ill-founded, started in 2005, but it was a formal marriage among the three countries of these dynamics of economics and security. It did not get very far, but there was an effort to really think about that in North American terms. And as we move into the review of the USMCA, we're going to have to think about that again in terms of what does North America look like? Does it even exist anymore? Is it going to be two separate relationships again? That's an open question in my mind. Because we also ended up with the Department of Homeland Security, which is this, this behemoth of an administrative entity in the United States. It's basically a big police force, including ICE, famously in the news these days. It's one of the biggest bureaucracies in the federal government, and it's a byproduct of those terrorist attacks. And Canada tried to reorient, so did Mexico, reorient its own bureaucracy to mirror some of this. Public safety is a byproduct of the advent of the homeland security. But linkage politics is here to stay, is what I'm trying to say. And so what does that look like for Donald Trump, and how do we bargain with him if we think we could get some kind of linkage politics? So here's where I come to a few historical echoes that some of you might remember, but these are really old, and I had some slides on this, but I shortened it out. The Reciprocity Treaty is a sort of folklorish kind of thing in Canada-U.S. relations. Hugely beneficial commodities trade between the United States and Canada during the American Civil War, just arbitrarily canceled by Congress in 1866 at the end of the war. The rhetoric around that is America was getting ripped off, and so they canceled it. And Canada was horrified by this, and they actually tried to renew it several times. Wilfrid Laurier got close in 1911, but then pulled back from it. Mackenzie King went to the Americans at the end of the Second World War because Canada was in some balance of payments problems, also pulled back from that politically. And then the 1965 Auto Pact, a sectoral, single sector agreement, really started to bring the countries together. In a way, it was a precursor of what we consider now the modern integration of the two economies. But then the Nixon shocks in 1971, the end of Bretton Woods, the end of the fixed exchange rate regime, 10% surcharge on all imports for balance of payments purposes, arguably an economic emergency, a financial emergency. Canada was blindsided, and they went to Washington to try to get some relief from this, and John Connolly, the Treasury Secretary at the time, said, forget it. And the rhetoric was the same. You're ripping us off. We're not giving you any breaks on this. So the senior Trudeau, Pierre, and Richard Nixon didn't get along very well. But you have a similar kind of crisis unfold in 1971 because of the end of Bretton Woods, the inability of Canada to get relief from this 10% surcharge. You see this unfold here today. But what unfolded in Canada in reaction to that was what was called the third option. Mitchell Sharp, who here was the Secretary of State for External Affairs, wrote a journal article outlining Canada's options going forward. And they include basically seeking new trade relationships, he argued in this article, pursue overt industrial policy, and Canadianize the economy. It's a lot of what you heard yesterday in the federal budget. Many, many similar kinds of echoes. This was not a formal white paper of the government, but it resonated, and it generated a whole bunch of things that some of you will be familiar with. The Foreign Investment Review Agency, the National Energy Program. There was a broad effort around industrial strategy, a kind of economic nationalism in Canada, again, in reaction to the end of Bretton Woods and the Nixon shocks. This was all prompted. And so how can we restructure the Canadian economy? We've been here before. We've seen this movie before. Canada has had to react to this kind of thing before. And the third option in the late 1970s was a good example of that. Then, of course, that didn't seem to be working for some politicians, and you had another commission, or another federal government effort, the Macdonald Commission, which laid out a whole bunch of things that connected to everything from the, looking at the impact, the implications of the repatriation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Quebec referendum, and so on. And only one of the recommendations was to pursue free trade with the United States. When Brian Mulroney came to office in 1984, that was one of the things that he pushed forward. And we ended up with the so-called Shamrock Summit, a very awkward summit. If you ever pull the video of this, they're all sitting there. It's like old Irish eyes are shining, and Reagan barely knows the words. I don't think he'd heard it before, but they're saying the dancing and so on. But it's to celebrate the launch of free trade negotiations between the two countries, effectively spiking the third option and throwing Canada's lot with the United States in terms of free trade, liberalizing trade between the three countries. So we've been here before, and one of the big questions I have going forward, I'm going to actually shut it down right here, but one of the big questions that we have going forward is whether or not the North America as a concept endures, or whether or not we're seeing the end of it. The tensions between the three countries have been there in the past, but never have they been so manifest. as when Donald Trump came to office. And again, my major point on Donald Trump is that he is a manifestation of this long-term erosion and doubts about the stability, the utility of the post-war architecture. And now Canada has to figure out a new way. Will it look like the third option, kind of revisiting of history? As you read the federal budget from yesterday, that's a lot of what the spending is oriented towards. Diversifying the Canadian economy, lots of industrial projects, infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. Whether or not that pays off or whether or not we end up at something new 4 years from now that reverses those efforts is really an open question. So I'll leave it at that. I've got more stuff if anyone wants to entertain the 51st state stuff and the gaslighting around that. I'm happy to do so, but for now, just thank you very much and entertain your questions.
We have a couple of microphones that we can bring to you. Oh, good, good, good. 1, 2, 3.
Oh, Hussein's going to have a good one.
Hi, Dr. Anderson. It's always a pleasure to hear you speak. You always get the juices flowing, and you always get me to think. So you've done your job beautifully. I have so many thoughts flowing through my head, so I'm going to try to make this as concise and coherent as possible. So my question is around kind of Canada's recent goal of diversifying its trade relations, and that goal in correlation to kind of interprovincial trade
Great question.
struggles. So coupled with kind of that geographical isolation that Canada obviously cannot control. So there are multiple factors at play, and my question is, how do you see that playing out in kind of these kind of 3 domains? Do things like international diversification, is it feasible? Are things like CANZEC a real option here? Because we think of like the UK is a vital player in that if it were to come in because of that geographical isolation. So that's kind of the big question that was kind of developing in my head as you spoke throughout your presentation.
It's an excellent question. There's been a lot of rhetoric about interprovincial trade barriers, and that rhetoric, in my view, has died off in the last few weeks. This is about provinces defending their turf. It's very difficult to knock these things down, and it's actually a story of Canadian history, the inability to knock down interprovincial trade barriers, and the lure of the American market has just been too great. It's too easy to cut down trees and pull stuff out of the ground and send it to the Americans raw, as opposed to really developing the economy as an integrated whole across the country. And it's partly, I mean, there's always discussions about value-added manufacturing in Canada, sort of processing some of those raw materials. Instead of sending the trees to the Americans, we should cut it down and turn it into 2x4s, put it together somehow, cut holes in it, put value-added together. That's been a perennial debate in the Canadian political economy. It's a real challenge. And it's just too easy. You can see Canada as a series of regional economies oriented north-south. And it's been very, very difficult throughout Canadian history to knit them together east-west. Interprovincial trade barriers are a real bugbear. There's lots of good studies about this. Canada-U.S. Canada-U.S. Foundation puts out lots of good research on this. That's really about provincial jurisdiction over particular areas of policy, and provinces guard those things zealously. And so there's been very little progress on that, going forward. Diversifying trading partners, Canada already has lots of trade agreements with lots of countries. I note just for curiosity that the EU and Mercosur are about to conclude an agreement. So the EU is looking for new markets in South America. And so that's going to be done. But, you know, that's always been really difficult. Again, it's too easy for Canadian business to ship stuff south. There's a hungry bunch of consumers down there that are willing to eat it up, and Canadians have gotten rich off of that. And so it's very difficult in these times to just suddenly turn a switch on that kind of stuff. And last thing I'll say, and this is maybe a joke, I made a bad joke a week or two ago, and I said, you know, if we're still talking in this country about interprovincial trade barriers and, you know, the kind of the value-added diversification of trading relationships and so on, 5 or 6 years from now, after Donald Trump is gone, if he's gone, right? After he's gone, maybe we should nominate Donald Trump for an Order of Canada, because it's forced Canadians to think about these issues, which if they did, would be a boon to the Canadian economy. Independent of who's in Washington, if Canadians could get focused on that, it would be a boon to the Canadian economy and to our standard of living. There's depressing standard of living statistics about how Canada's fallen behind per capita and so on. I won't show them to you, they're too depressing. So yeah, that's a very good question, yeah. Yeah.
People in, is there a serious percentage of people that actually took that seriously?
No.
That, like, just
no. But I can explain why. And I mean, I wish the Canadian press would stop paying attention to this. I mean, Trump is really good at gaslighting people and twisting like this is a long-standing wound for a lot of Canadians, especially in English Canada. This kind of anxiety, annexation, et cetera, et cetera. Trump knows this and he twists the knife. But if you think about this from the other side of the border and what adding 40 million Canadians would do to the American political system, especially as evenly divided as it is, you can imagine as many as from 2 to 26 new senators in the American Senate, as many as 60 new House members. Almost all of them would be Democrats. Maybe, I'm not even sure in Alberta that you would get any Republicans elected to the House and the Senate right now. And if you know anything about American history, there's always been this balance in introducing new states. The last in 1959 were Alaska and Hawaii, Republican, Democrat. And that goes all the way back to the antebellum period prior to the Civil War. DC is still not a state. That's 600,000 disenfranchised Americans, and it's not going to happen anytime soon. So, you know, if you look at that gaslighting from the other perspective, what would that do to the American political system? No American takes this seriously. No Republican takes this seriously because they're having trouble getting elected to begin with in a country that's increasingly democratic. So adding, you know, 41 million Canadians, most of whom would be Democrat, maybe some blue dog Democrats, conservative Democrats out west, but that's about as good as it gets. So nobody really takes that seriously. It's considered a kind of a joke. And I wish the press would stop picking that up myself, but yeah. No, there's more to it than that. Yeah.
Hello. You talked about the Sharp Commission. If it was a Sharp Commission, I'll just call it that.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but Mark Carney talked a lot yesterday about catalyzing private sector investment.
Yeah.
And I think that's been a subject on a lot of people in Canada's minds, considering how large the capital markets in the US are and how that hasn't really showed up here at all. And like you said before, that when we tried this, the public sector stuff did work, but the private markets did not follow. Why didn't they follow? And do you think they will now? And if you think that they won't now, what do you think that we could do that would make them follow?
Compel them. I mean, one of the problems with the Canadian corporate sector, in my view, is that it's mostly small and medium-sized enterprises. You know, you take the Canadian auto sector out, which is a big branch plant sector, you know, connected to American multinationals. Or, you know, you have other foreign nationals, national firms, you know, like the Japanese automakers, the South Koreans, et cetera. You take those out of the Canadian economy and you've got really a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises. It isn't huge scale of homegrown kind of firms. And this is partly reflected in their ability to access tariff-free trade into the United States. They just don't have the capacity to do the paperwork to qualify, et cetera, et cetera. Canadians have difficulty in adopting new innovative technologies, partly because they all have to be imported and it's very expensive. And so the gap between the loonie and most other currencies becomes a problem. Canadian firms put off introducing productivity enhancing technologies. Access to capital has been a big problem, again, because Canada is not particularly capital rich. If you think about rare earths and all the talk about rare earths these days, Canada has a lot, but it can't exploit it, partly because it's expensive to do that. And so it needs foreign investment to do a lot of that kind of extraction. So it's a real challenge. Part of the argument that the Mulroney government made about promoting the NAFTA was Canadians will have access to a greater pool of capital. Multinationals will come to Canada. They will drop down, plop down here, make their home here, access Canada's well-educated labor market, cheap healthcare, et cetera, and then be able to access capital markets from the United States. It never really happened. Instead, firms chose to situate themselves in the US. This has been going on a long time. Situate in the US and service Canada and Mexico as possible. And so it's really a big challenge. Your question about whether or not we could change that now and how, I think it would require, I don't know, some elbows up nationalism on the part of Canadians to just say, okay, we're going to do things differently this time. But how long will they do that? And again, will they be doing that 5 years from now? If we are, I think that's maybe all to the good. You have some more homegrown kind of industries, some entrepreneurialism, more risk-taking, a kind of entrepreneurial risk-taking culture where you're incentivized to take risk and put your own skin in the game, et cetera, et cetera. Canadians are a little reticent to do that relative to the United States. And so could we change the bankruptcy laws, for example, to reflect that and make it more possible for you to generate a startup without really feeling like this is your one and only chance and you might have a way back if you fail the first time. So there's a lot of things like that that I think the Canadian governments could do, but whether or not I don't think they need coercion necessarily. But again, if we're talking about this 5 years from now, then I think that's all to the good. But they're all real problems. Yeah, hot pursuit. Yeah.
And looking at that, the answer to that question, then it's just mostly fraud and deregulation. Do you think that there is an appetite, especially looking at bubbles like the AI bubble,
Right.
sort of inflating at the moment? Well, whether it's a bubble or not, we don't know. Do you think Canada has the capacity to support just fiscal irresponsibility like that if it does make everyone's lives better?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of entrepreneurs in this country that would like to stay, and sadly, there's too many Canadians once they get to a certain level of success want to head south, and they because that's where the capital is, that's where the risk, the venture taking is, and so it's a real challenge. Could the likes of Nortel, without government support, just sort of without national champions being picked by the state. Could that happen again? For sure. But I mean, even Bombardier, look what's happened to them in aircraft manufacturing. They've had to sell out to Airbus. And so it's a big challenge in this country. And it's the story, I think, of the Canadian economy throughout its entire history. It's just too easy to sell those raw materials and let them go south because it's a way to get rich relatively quick. It's tougher to do some of the things that you're talking about.
Hello. So my question, while we're talking about the economy, I feel like I would be remiss to not ask you about the worker. And
Of course.
Obviously you've touched on how, the history around the NAFTA, the history around, the reticence of the United States to maybe once there was a lot of sort of let's export our labor elsewhere, right? We can get cheaper labor done,
Yep.
cheaper,
Yep.
Companies can go elsewhere, get that same work instead of having to abide by labor rules and
Yep.
restrictions within your own country. So my question really is, I've seen that argument obviously come very often in sort of the whether it was the anti-NAFTA, the anti kind of globalization of trade coming from Democrats and liberals. And the real shift that, I feel like I saw in the past kind of 10 years is sort of the willingness for Republicans to also adopt that narrative of sort of the, America first, isolationism. I'm wondering from your perspective, do you see that as something that like, were you surprised to see their willingness to sort of go full in? And do you see that as more of a symptom of, okay, they're on board with this Trump train, therefore they're going to align with this sort of America First isolationist type of international foreign policy around the economy? Or do you see it as more, okay, well, these are two things that are linked with like the security question, and so then that's why they're buying into it? Because it still feels so antithetical to like the neoliberal policies that a lot of them purport to say that they agree with.
So, okay, if I can, I'll address your question in two ways. First, I think with respect to the worker and organized labor, I think all three governments in North America did a horrible job in trying to sell the virtues of the adjustment process. There was no doubt that once you open trade between the three countries, there was going to be some movement. Some basic manufacturing was going to go to where labor was cheaper. But there were also new jobs created throughout North America that, that weren't just basic manufacturing. Those jobs that were displaced, there weren't really programs in place to retrain those people. As I say in my class all the time, you don't turn somebody that was an auto worker putting hubcaps on into somebody that produces semiconductors overnight. You got to have the support for retraining, and that's always been lacking. Governments have always assumed that labor that's released from some sectors will find its way into something else, and that just didn't happen. And you saw it very concentrated in places like the industrial Midwest, where workers were just left hanging. In factory towns were hollowed out because factories picked up and left. Governments did a terrible job dealing with that. On the party politics, though, that's one of the really fascinating things about what's happened in whatever you can call the Donald Trump's coalition. The Republican Party has turned into, or tried to position itself as, the party of the working class all of a sudden, and not the party of big business, as identified with Ronald Reagan. And that's one of the reasons the Ronald Reagan sampling from Doug Ford a week or so ago was so, it really pinched, because that's a different kind of Republican. And the Republican Party has tried to capitalize on what they perceive to be the Democrats taking the working class, their traditional voters, unionized voters, for granted. They were up for grabs starting in 2015 and 16. And all the way through 2024, you could see the Democratic Party bleeding working class voters, especially white working class voters, were coming to the Republican Party. I think it's a pretty weak affiliation with Republicans now, but what's really fascinating is the inability to shine light between Democrats and Republicans on the merits of trade. And so, they've both become very populist, sort of anti-trade parties in many ways, fighting for that same group of voters. In the results last night, you can see that some of those voters that gave Trump a chance have drifted back to the Democrats, if you look at some of the exit polling and who voted for who. And so the party system in the United States is very much in flux. It's not the simple left-right, unions, pro-business, Democrat, Republican like it used to be. They're much more clustered on some issues together on economic policy. And it's sort of hard to tease them apart at times. They're fighting over those same voters right now. It's really fascinating.
Great lecture. From your perspective, both over the next 3 years, but say a little longer, what do Americans actually want from Canada, do you think?
I think
Top priorities.
I think the status quo is what I don't think Americans, perceive Canada to be some kind of enemy. They're more distrustful of Mexico, certainly, than they are of Canada. They're more distrustful of the Chinese than just about anybody. I don't think they see Canadians on the whole as certainly along the northern tier, where Americans have lots of interaction with Canadians. Some of you probably got in the newspaper last week a big brochure saying, "Come visit America," some tourism advertising, right? So, they recognize that damage has been done and that sentiment, hurt feelings have been hurt, and so on. But what do Americans want from? I think they want the continued cooperation on security. I think Canada, for example, could spend could do a lot on defense spending, which you saw in the budget yesterday. There's going to be an effort to not only maintain 2% of GDP, but maybe get to the NATO target of 5%. And some of that is going to come through northern infrastructure development and dual-use defense infrastructure development, which I think has been a long, long time. That's something that the Harper government promised to do and never did anything. So there could be some things along those lines. I mean, I think it would be a mistake for Canada to cancel the F-35. I think that Trump would take, Canada's already developing that. There are Canadians working on that project already. And so, doing things on defense spending would probably be good, sort of defense cooperation in NATO, carrying the load. So that's one area. And then I think also just that integrated supply chain, critical minerals development, et cetera, et cetera. I think those are things that, to the extent, that Americans actually think about Canada and know something about what's going on here, it's that continued economic relationship. And a lot of Americans are very worried about what's happening with tariffs. They're very upset farmers are really pissed off about tariffs and the impact of the trade war with China, and the tariff revenue is going right back to the farmers, but it's not enough. It's ridiculous, the kind of chaos that's being created. And so for how long is our American farmers and manufacturers going to put up with this? So far, the manufacturers are eating those tariffs, but that's going to change. And by midterms this time next year, we might see a very different makeup and a wounded duck, president by that time, a lame duck president. So yeah, it's a long-winded answer to your question, but I think defense spending and the kind of that continued economic relationship, because it's really important. Oil and gas, hydro from Quebec and Ontario, I mean, those are all super important, even if most Americans walking down the street aren't necessarily thinking about it. So yeah.
Hello, I'm Nelson Amaral from Computing Science here at the University of Alberta. And as we meet here as friends of the university, I like to bring the conversation to some influences from the United States that are affecting not only the university, but the entire country. And that's in immigration and the issue of visas for students, right? I think we made a huge mistake during the Trudeau government when addressing the two-bit colleges that were churning out visas and not separating the big universities from that policy, right? So I think that we are hurting the country significantly because having a closed door policy where close to half of our international students are not able to come to the country is really hurting us. But on the other hand, if I go and I sit down with non-university friends, the argument that I hear is, why should we bring foreigners here? Why we're not educating the Albertans, right? So I see that politicians have a difficult situation to deal with, and I see this as coming from the South.
Yeah. Just very broadly, the sentiment in this country about immigration in the last year and a half or so has changed radically. Canadians used to take the merits of immigration just for granted. It's like, yeah, more. Let's, the more the merrier kind of thing. And that's changed. And I was a little disappointed that the Trudeau government sort of pinned the housing crisis on students, and restricting, then they restricted student visas. And you saw in the budget yesterday, more restrictions from the Carney government. And of course, in the United States, there's kind of been a war on higher education that I lament in a way, because higher education and the quality of American higher education has been a major pillar of American soft power. And that's just another area that it's just being attacked. And so, they are also similarly restricting student visas, even in some cases, threatening to throw people out of the country. And maybe Canada should be thinking about this in terms of trying to become a beneficiary of that and attracting more talent, to higher education here instead of restricting the number of visas. And I agree that there should be some separation of what kind of schools are applying for these things, because when you restrict them, there's just going to be a kind of a heavy lobbying effort, almost a lottery or something, to try and get these things. And the diploma mills, whatever you want to call them, these kind of smaller institutions that pop up. You know, they're going to be pretty aggressive in trying to get them. Meanwhile, we'll be, you know, scrambling. We might want to admit somebody to our program, but we'll have a difficult time because we don't know if they're going to be able to apply for a visa, et cetera, et cetera. So it just complicates everything for us that we're restricting things that way. So I agree wholeheartedly. And I think that would be, it'd be a useful way to relatively inexpensively augment a bit of Canada's soft power by not pursuing this kind of thing. I don't know what the rationale for the restrictions yesterday announced yesterday really is. Housing, I don't know. We'll figure it out, I guess. But yeah, I'm with you on that. I'm not so sure that that's the wisest move. And certainly not a wise move what's going on in the United States with, it's a meat axe approach to trying to do something about whatever the perceived ills are of higher education. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, has it never occurred to anyone, silly question here, but the whole world is so much more intertwined now than it was 100 years ago. It's just incredible. If you were to say stop trade anywhere,
yeah,
it would just destroy economies, and it wouldn't just be that, but it would lead out to all that. But the whole world is interconnected. Why does no one ever ask that question? I've never heard it talked about on a world scale.
Well, maybe this isn't really a pushback on your question at all, but just to maybe point out the uniqueness of the post-war period that we're talking about. This architecture that I was describing and trying to, you know, get our minds around is really unique. This post-war period of rules-based trade and commercial activity, integration of economies, both multilaterally and regionally, is really quite unique. And it's not the default with which we have organized ourselves. And that's why, I mean, for all the protests, you know, I had students in my class that would go out and fight with the cops at economic meetings and come back and tell me about it and throw, you know, they would be there clashing with the police. We're going to miss it when it's gone. Because as you're pointing out, you know, the Canadian economy, if you think about the Canadian economy and its structure, if it not able to access foreign markets for its excess production, would be very, very different. It's a small population. We would not have the kinds of production runs, access to different kinds of goods. We would be much poorer because we would have to fend for ourselves and because we couldn't sell stuff to other people. And of course, you know, import pineapples, fruit during the winter. But it would be a completely different economic structure if we couldn't trade. And we will continue to trade here. But just to point out that this architecture, flawed though it might be, and there's lots of reasons to pick at it and criticize it and think about reforming it, but we're going to miss it when it's gone because it's been a boon to Canadians and to much of the world, really. So, yeah,
so where do you think we're going to be in 5 years? Are we going to be drifting back to the old ways, or do you think Canada will have significantly changed?
I don't know. I mean, I don't foresee Canadians ever stopping trade with the United States. I don't know how far we'll get down this road towards a kind of renewed third option. You know, Carney keeps talking about there's been a fundamental breach. Our relationship with America is fundamentally over. No, it's not. It would take a very long time to unwind things. Even the auto sector, which Trump seems clearly determined to destroy, and try to get investment, you know, repatriated to the United States. Auto firms don't think that way. Those supply chains are well entrenched. Those are billions and billions of dollars of investments that are going into either Southern Ontario or Ohio or Michigan. And you don't just pull up stakes and reorient those supply chains overnight. My guess is that they're riding it out. And even the announcements of, you know, oh, well, Canadian firm moving down to, that's in EVs, which the demand for EVs has sort of fallen off the table in many areas. And so those investments have declined. Those are just on hold. And so it's not as if this is an immediate reaction to Donald Trump. Oh, yes, sir, we will move our factory to Michigan and hire Americans. This is going to take a long time to unwind, more than the remainder of Trump's term in office. And so, I mean, is that what the Koreans and the Japanese are doing, playing out the string, hoping for, you know, I don't know, better leadership down the road? Maybe that's what they're doing. I don't know if that they're thinking in those terms or not. Should the Canadian government think along those lines and think about 5 years out and just kind of play out the string, placate this administration for the time being? I guess it depends a little on whether you think what's going on is connected directly to this administration or something bigger, as I've been kind of arguing, because I don't see this sentiment, I don't see a radically different sentiment unfolding in very many places. We haven't talked much about China, but a lot of this is about decoupling Europe and the United States from China. It's a kind of a bifurcated world of economic powers that are going to have their satellites around them. And that's what we're doing. It's about decoupling those economies. And that's hard. That's a long, long haul on that one. So 5 years from now, things will look pretty much the same. But maybe we won't have somebody that's gaslighting everybody left, right, and center. Anyway, it just depends on how you think this is, if it's just Trump or if it's something bigger. And I personally think it's something bigger because it's been brewing everywhere. You know, it's happening in all different parts of the world, not just here in North America.
Sorry, if I could
Chair's
just interject one
prerogative or something.
last quick question. Appreciating that it might be gaslighting, the whole 51st state thing has certainly provoked a response from Canadians across the country. And I'm just wondering if you think that in the province of Quebec, there's a significant portion of the population that's smiling wryly at the angst and frustration and anger of English-speaking Canadians about the idea of being subsumed by a larger English-speaking culture.
Yes, you know, and I think it's more the gaslighting has been more pointed in English Canada because there have been longer standing cultural, you know, anxieties. You don't have the sort of language difference to sort of immunize you culturally from and say and state, hey, I'm different from you. You Yankees to the south, right? We're too different. We walk among you, kind of thing, right? And it's too similar. And so I think that's why the 51st state commentary is twisting a knife, pouring salt in very old wounds. And just one small irony about, you know, Trump's he doesn't think like this, but Trump's 51st state comments imply in economic integration terms a common market where you'd have the free flow of factors of production everywhere. And I don't think that's quite what he has in mind. Anyway, but yeah, I think it is. I think you're spot on some of that, where you know you do have these kind of cultural anxieties that get stoked and scratched and picked at, and I think that's why you got the elbows up, and it's a very strong reaction. You hear it at every hockey game, and it's during the baseball playoffs, et cetera. I mean, people react to that kind of stuff. They don't like being talked to that way, and so yeah.
Greg, I'm going to pretend that these are from the online questions, but they're really mine. First, two pieces. Can Canada trust the US? And if you were able to advise the federal government or the provinces, both, what would you advise them to do during this Trump administration?
Question is easy. I gave you an answer to that over dinner, but most of what goes on in Canada-U.S. relations doesn't happen at the White House or on Parliament Hill or 24 Sussex. Is that open? Are they still working? No, it's not open right now. Wherever the Prime Minister is living. But most of Canada-U.S. relations does not happen there. What happens between the principals filters down and affects parts of the bureaucracy. There's no doubt about that. You know, civil servants in Ottawa feel just as pissed off as anybody else. And, you know, the civil servants in America, they end up having to respond to what comes from above. But Canadians and Americans pick up the phone and talk to each other at a bureaucratic level like no two countries. So DHS and public safety, talking about border security, working with each other at customs pre-clearance and, you know, at Pearson or out in Vancouver or at border facilities, land border facilities. They're always talking to each other. They're sort of the best of friends, even though one group carries sidearms and the other carries, I don't know what, clipboard, I don't know what. You know, they work together at a very functional level, and they will continue to do so. It's often at the political level where you see this kind of rhetoric these days, even ambassadors sniping at each other, et cetera. And that's because the ambassadors owe their jobs to the people at the top. And so just be aware that so much of Canada-U.S. Canada does have a privileged access to many of the halls of power in the United States in ways that many, many other countries do not, and are envious of Canada's ability to do that. And so at a functional level, there's still plenty to rest easy tonight about. And again, ignore the gaslighting from above. And then your last question was,
To advise.
yeah, the Prime
federal-
Minister. I would, even if he paid a price among his core supporters and the elbows up nationalists that are really fight, 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 I would play for time. And I would also, I would also make clear that, look, we are doing things that are serving your interests at the same time they are doing ours. And that's why I like Northern defense spending. It reasserts Canada's place. Canada is a complete free rider in NATO, has been for a long time. Not alone on that, but a total free rider. And it needs to step up, especially given what's going on in Europe and the instability around the world. And climate change is making the North more navigable. And Canada has to defend that. Canada has to be their physical presence. And it's going to be a long time before these submarines get purchased, maybe from the South Koreans, who knows where they're coming from. But a physical presence in the North is going to be essential. Otherwise, the Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans are going to basically dictate what happens there. And so something there that you could say, hey, look, we're helping out with this, I would, but playing for time.
Thank you very much for an engaging talk and answering so many questions this evening. And such civility, isn't that lovely? So I'm going to adjust a couple of things you've said, one being that perhaps we don't need to let Tariff Man live rent-free in our heads. If we think about the greater picture than what the President and the Prime Minister might do. Yeah. And play for time. Yeah. That is quite reassuring to me. So thank you very much for this. And thank you to all of you for coming and for participating.
Thank you.
I'm just going to take a sec to, again, thank you for coming and remind you that this is why the university exists, for the exchange of information, ideas, questions. So I trust that most of us have learned something tonight, and all of us hopefully have a smile on our face as we leave, and again, a civilized manner. The next event for the Friends will be a Raise the Bar on February 3rd. So a Raise the Bar event, it takes place at the Blue Chair. We have dinner and we listen to one of the U of A's profs speak about their particular topic of expertise. And so the next topic is regarding artificial intelligence, deep fakes, and ethics. It's a very casual environment, very collegial. And we enjoy an evening together. So February 3rd. Again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking part with the Friends. Join us if you can. We'll never ask you for money. And thanks to all our volunteers. That's it. Good evening.